In today's section of notes, we'll be taking a look at the civil rights movement moving into the 1960s. We'll look at some of the protests and actions taken by civil rights activists. We'll also look at some of the early triumphs that they're able to accomplish. In 1961, white and black activists took part in the Freedom Rides. This two-bus trip from Washington, D.C. across the South would test the Supreme Court decisions banning segregated seating on interstate bus routes and segregated facilities in bus terminals. These activists hoped to provoke a violent reaction that would convince the Kennedy administration to enforce the law. As the first bus reached the Alabama state line, white racists got on the bus carrying chains, brass knuckles, and pistols. They brutally beat African American riders and white activists who tried to intervene. Still, the riders managed to go on. Then, on May 4th of 1961, Bus 1 pulled into the Birmingham, Alabama bus terminal. The riders saw a hostile mob waiting, some of them holding iron bars. As the bus pulled into the terminal, the riders were removed and taken out of sight of the bus terminal. Many of them were brutally beaten. The ride on Bus 1 had come to an end. In Anniston, Alabama, about 200 angry whites attacked Bus 2. The mob followed the activists out of town. When one of the tires blew, they smashed a window and tossed in a firebomb. The Freedom Riders spilled out just before the bus exploded. The riders of Bus 2 were then picked up by SNCC volunteers in Nashville. From Nashville, they rode into Birmingham. When they arrived in Birmingham, policemen, members of Police Chief Bull Connor's police force, pulled them from the bus, beat them, and drove them back into Tennessee. Defiantly, they returned to the Birmingham bus terminal, but their bus driver, fearing for his life, refused to transport them. In protest, they occupied the whites-only waiting room at the terminal for 18 hours until a solution was reached. After an angry phone call from U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, bus company officials convinced the driver to proceed. The riders set out for Montgomery, Alabama. Although Alabama officials had promised Kennedy that the riders would be protected, when they arrived in Montgomery, a mob of whites, many carrying bats and lead pipes, fell upon the riders. John Dewar, a Justice Department official on the scene, called the Attorney General to report what was happening. A bunch of men led by a guy with a bleeding face are beating the passengers. There are no cops. It's terrible. There's not a cop in sight. People are yelling, "Get 'em! Get 'em!" It's awful. The violence provoked exactly the response the Freedom Riders wanted. Newspapers throughout the nation and abroad denounced the beatings. President Kennedy arranged to give the Freedom Riders direct support. The Justice Department sent 400 U.S. Marshals to protect the riders on the last part of their journey to Jackson, Mississippi. In addition, the Attorney General and the Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation in all interstate travel facilities, including waiting rooms, restrooms, and lunch counters. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people, including about 75,000 whites, converged on the nation's capital. They were hoping to convince Congress to pass John F. Kennedy's proposed Civil Rights Bill. They assembled on the grassy lawn of the Washington Monument and marched to the Lincoln Memorial. There, people listened to speakers demand the immediate passage of the Civil Rights Bill. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. appeared, the crowd exploded in applause. In his now famous speech, "I Have a Dream," he appealed for peace and racial harmony, saying, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama will be transformed into a situation where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers." 2 months after King's speech, President Kennedy was shot and killed. His successor, President Johnson, pledged to carry on Kennedy's work, and on July 2, 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination because of race, religion, nationality, or gender. In the summer of 1964, an election year, members of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, began registering as many African Americans to vote as they could in southern states. They hoped their campaign would receive national publicity, which would in turn influence Congress to pass a Voting Rights Act. They focused most of their attention in Mississippi, and their efforts became known as the Freedom Summer. To strengthen their efforts, civil rights groups recruited college students and trained them in nonviolent resistance. Thousands of student volunteers, mostly white, many of them female, went into Mississippi to help register voters. For some, the job proved deadly. In June of 1964, 3 civil rights workers disappeared in Mississippi. Investigators later learned that Klansmen and local police had murdered the men, 2 of whom were white. Through the summer, the racial beatings and murders continued, along with the burning of businesses, homes, and churches. The efforts of civil rights activists during the Freedom Summer and of other activists eventually did lead to the passage of a Voting Rights Act in 1965. The act eliminated the so-called literacy tests that had disqualified many African American voters. Although the Voting Rights Act marked a major civil rights victory, some felt that the law did not go far enough. Centuries of discrimination had produced social and economic inequalities. Anger over these inequalities led to a series of violent disturbances in the cities of the North that we'll take a look at in our next set of notes.